Chairman, Debaters on Climate Change, Professor Satish. I welcome you all for the Thursday evening seminar organized by Dr. Parmesh. And this has covered many interesting topics. Today's topic is very relevant because it's more than 1.5 years of COVID stresses that all of us had. There are a lot of people who are under various kinds of psychological stress because they're not able to communicate and interact with others. So it's very lucky that we have a seminar which will address some of these issues. So I thank Dr. Parmesh for organizing this talk. Dr. Parmesh.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Distinguished members of the DYHS Center Climate Change and scientists of the Indian Institute of Science, and members of the Indian National Chapter of the COMHAD, Commonwealth Countries Health and Disability Organization globally, and also the IAP members, some of the members, and Adichunchanaburi University faculty members. And I think good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever from USA to Australia. At the outset, I sincerely thank Professor S.K. Satish in the absence and Professor Srinivasan giving an opportunity to starting this program in our DYHS Center Climate Change. It is a very successful, very well appreciated program, as a monthly program, as a matter of fact. As you rightly pointed, the current topic, what we have this month's topic is overall environmental issues in the prevention of the suicidal tendency. Just to highlight some introductory remarks, as you all know, suicide is a global public mental health issue which is quite avoidable. Nearly 8 lakhs individuals end their life. Every 40 seconds, one person will die globally. And this month is the World Suicidal Day. September 10th is the day. We can prevent suicide by sharing our mental health issues, by creating awareness and taking action in our communities, medical, justice, law, and politics, and create hope through the action by knowing the impact of the environmental we live in. Many suicides occurs impulsively in a moment of crisis, with breakdown in the life stress from the financial problems, breakdown in the relationship or chronic diseases, the conflict, disasters, violence, abuse, or loss of and sense of isolation. We touch these issues during the talk from the speaker. The strongest risk factor for suicide is a previous attempt to end life. Most common method used in India is the pesticides. We have the challenge to remove stigma and taboo by psychotherapy, by cognitive behavioral therapy, learning new ways to deal with the stressful experience, dialectal behavior therapy, teaching a person to recognize where their feelings are achieve or disruptive and teach the skill to avoid this situation. To teach these skills, we have with us excellent speaker today, who is none other than Professor Shekhar P. Seshadri. He is a senior professor of psychiatry in the Department of Child and Adolescent NIMHANS, Bangalore. He is the Dean of the Behavioral Science Division with 35 years experience, and he did his MBBS at GB Pant Hospital at Maulana Azad Medical College, New Delhi in 1979, and completed his MD in Psychiatry in the National Institute of Mental Health Neurosciences in 1985, and he is a Silver Jubilee Medal Award for standing first in the MD. His research work is very well known in life skills training, child sexual abuse, masculinities, women's mental health issues, and sexual minorities. He has authored many books, few of them many scientific papers in peer-reviewed journal. The Art of Science of Nurturing in book in 2013 is a very well-known book. He has received many local, national, international awards and adjudged as an eminent inspirational personality. His vision for enabling the access to mental health for the most vulnerable child population This has now extended into somewhat, that is, support, advocacy, and mental health interventions for children and vulnerable circumstances and distress. A national initiative and integrated resource for child protection, mental health, and psychological social care, supported by the Ministry of Women and Child Health Department, Government of India. As a person, he is the most committed individual. He is also a artist, as a musician. That have learned all these things. His family is very well known in the art and all these things. We were the art couples. He shared the room in one of the conference in Gulbarga. We were both our faculty. During that time, TV program, music was, or the dance and music program. There he asked, somebody was dancing beautifully, very well. And Parmesh, do you know who it is? He said, I didn't realize. That is Meenakshi Seshadri, my sister, I say, he said. I still remember. I still remember. I think the family is very well known. As a matter of fact, it's a great honor introducing the speaker. In addition, now I'm going to do the chairman. This another eminent personality of Bangalore, of our country, is chairing this session. He is none other than Dr. S. Kalyanasundram, who did his MBBS in Madras University in 1970, MD in Psychiatry in NIMHANS in Bangalore 1975. He is a faculty at NIMHANS from 1976 to 1981. And now he's been doing private practice since 1981. He was the honorary CEO of the Richmond Fellowship Society, Bangalore. Currently, he is honored advisor to RFS Bangalore branch. He is a professor of psychiatry and principal of the RFPG College from 1999 to 2015. He is involved with the psychiatric rehabilitation for over 3 decades. Published articles in national, international journal, contributed chapters to PG textbooks and psychiatry in medicine. Several awards, including Eminent Psychiatric Award by IPS KC 2005. He is a finalist Bangalorean of the year 2013. WAPR Indian Chapter Award for Excellence Psychosocial Rehabilitation in 2016. He is an American Psychiatric Society and for dedicated Distinguished Leadership Award in 2019. He is honored by IPS for contribution PSR December 2020. He's a passion about teaching and also a great golfer. He enjoys the golf as a matter. Most relaxed person, committed person, and most really liked person in Bangalore. We are proud to have them here. Over to you, Professor Kalyanasundram. Take over. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parmesh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Srinivasan, and also for the center, Divecha Center for Climate Change, for having given this opportunity for both my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Shekhar Seshadri, and myself to be part of this evening's program. I'm delighted to know that you have these Thursday programs conducting many such events, and to take on this topic of suicide, environmental issues and suicide during the what is called the suicide month of the year is very apt and very topical. The minute we hear someone has committed suicide, we sometimes read in the paper about some personalities people may be known of, aware of, or somebody known to you, maybe a student, maybe a faculty member, maybe a family member, but the emotions that it can churn in any one of us, family member or a professional, is very unique. Some people say suicide is a brave act. Some people say suicide is a cowardice act. It's a debatable point. But the issue here is what makes a person take one's life. Either one single cause, either one single event, is there one single situation that makes them vulnerable that they take the decision, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes over a period of time, talking about it, mulling over it, planning and executing. This phase of thinking, talking and mulling over it and executing it, in many people may last weeks and sometimes even months. So what is the responsibility of people around him or her to understand what's going on? How do we identify? How do we take in people who are seemingly at risk? Are they talking about it? Do they give a clue? Do they mention about it? Do they plan and do they indicate? Suicide is a suicidal thought and attempts which are not successful or actually crying or cries for help. How do we recognize that? If we recognize it, how do we handle that? How do we go about trying to help this individual? And Parmesh also mentioned about taboo and stigma. If there is one set of illnesses that revolve around stigma and taboo, is a large section of people suffering from mental health issues. And suicide is a central event in such a mental health scenario where some of them in the background of severe mental illness, as a part of the symptom complex of the disease, may actually attempt and be successful in their suicide. Parmesh also mentioned about people committing suicide, the numbers of people. I believe a person dies by suicide every 40 seconds. India has a dubious distinction of being called the suicide capital of the world. Almost 50% of the people visited healthcare facility 4 days prior to death, but only 25% had health diagnosis related to suicide. There are several indications one can actually see in people who are planning to commit suicide. And coming from high-powered academic institutions, the suicide seems to be not very far behind for them. What makes these people take the decision, which in itself become the end of their life? There's no second chance there. What happens to people who are left behind? What happens to people who are family members? What happens to spouses? I think there is a whole gamut of issues that surround this tragic event called suicide. I have great pleasure in now inviting Dr. Shekhar Seshadri, whom I have known for over 40 years, the dear friend and a colleague, and a very erudite scholar, and a well-known, well-in-demand speaker. In fact, I was just joking with Shekhar. People are known to go pub hopping, but Shekhar is known for talk hopping. Soon after this, he's got another talk at 7:15. Yesterday, I had a chat with him. He said, I will talk to you between my two talks. Now, that is how busy he is. That is how much of a demand he is in. And the amount of contribution he has made to child mental health prevention in the large parts of India as a Supreme Court mandated individual to provide this help. I think we have a wonderful person to talk on this topic. Now I'm handing over from one Seshadri to another Seshadri. My full name being Kalyan Sundaram Seshadri, my initial, and to Shekhar Seshadri. We are not related by relationship, but we are related by friendship. Shekhar, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sundar, and thank you, Parmesh. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas, for this singular honor. I want you, friends, to pay particular attention to three key factors in the subject of today's session: environmental factors, preventive approaches, and suicidal tendencies. Please mark the deliberate word tendencies, which encompasses an entire range of suicidality. I am also conscious that of the almost 50 people present here today, you come from the scientist community, you come from the teaching fraternity. I also therefore want to table to you certain social realities as a platform from which I would like to share my thesis with you. What is it about frustrations in the scientific community that leads to despondency? What is it in the life of students that compels them to consider life as not being worthwhile? What about farmers' suicides? Why is it that over the decades, the age of attempts has progressively reduced, and you are having younger and younger people manifesting this kind of behavior? While I leave you for a moment to ponder on the significance of these contexts, social and ecological, one might wonder then, if you take a very distal approach, and by distal, I mean, look at the context that Dr. Kalyan Sundaram has laid for you. There is the mental health, mental illness context, a circumscribed. Uh, may I request people online to kindly mute their mics? Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate your kindness. So there is a mental health context, and there is the immediacy, which Dr. Kalyan Sundaram referred to as impulsivity. But there is also a larger socio-political context to the kind of frustrations in human lives that then create a belief structure of life, or is its absence, as a recourse when you reach a situation of helplessness. And this is the range of context that we have to navigate to understand the complexities and nuances of suicidality. And as I proceed to navigate this complexity with you, it is also an invitation for the 50 of you who are present as we go along to put your thoughts and your questions on chat, and Dr. Kalyan Sundaram and I will collectively curate and navigate these questions as I finish my sharing with you to really look at some of your ideas to kind of cap the session. Friends, let me present you with certain very striking features about suicidality within the framework that I have laid for you as a starting premise. Many years ago, when I started work in the area of death, dying, of trauma, of suicidality, and I had spoken to, let's say, approximately 100 people who were suicidal. It was astonishing in a revelatory fashion that upwards of 90 of them at some point of time in their lives earlier heard something from their significant others, family members, a feedback that was essentially devaluing. Let me demonstrate to you what this means in terms of a child's response within the family. Child takes an exam, the report card comes. The child takes the report card, goes to the parent, gives it to the parent. The parent takes a look at the report card, looks at the child, looks at the report card, looks at the child. and shakes his or her head. Nothing is said, but a lot is conveyed. Or the parent takes a look at the report card, looks at the child, looks at the report card, looks at the child, and says, when will you improve? Looks at the report card, looks at the child, looks at the report card, looks at the child, and says, you will never improve. Or, why are children like you born? Or, why don't you die? Now, sometimes these statements are made perhaps not with the deliberate intention of hurting that sensitive child. It is perhaps made in the mistaken notion that a way to motivate a seemingly unmotivated child is to shame the child or guilt the child into. But we do not realize the emotional impact or the emotionally abusive nature of that communication, because that feedback is embedded in the child's memory in terms of the value that you ascribe to your identity. And somewhere later in life, 5 years later, 10 years later, when push comes to shove, what it triggers is to say, in any case, my identity and my being had been devalued. What does it matter if I live or die? Or who does it matter for? The point I'm trying to make is, if you look at the whole framework of mental health that Dr. Kalyan Sundaram alluded to, and if you look at the framework that Dr. Paramesh introduced in terms of the various kind of therapies and the context of stress in which suicidality is embedded, one notion to keep in mind is the impact that adverse childhood experiences have and the impact that trauma has in structuring a person's mind in a manner that negative options or negative recourse is triggered because of the kind of conditioning that takes place. This brings me to the second point, particularly from the perspective of the scientist community and the student community, and what is called as the reality of your lived experiences. Your lived experience. Let's pause for a moment and think of what stress actually means and how people respond to stress, and why is there an extreme response to stress, namely suicidality, when a person gets pushed to the limits of his or her tolerance or endurance. Stress is an internal and an external response to a reality, a challenging situation. It does not have a tangible existence out there. So if you look at a student community, you have examinations, that's a stress. You have not done well in the examinations, that's a stress. You've done well in your exit examinations, but there are competitive examinations to take, that's a stress. You've done the competitive exam, you haven't got into the university or the college of your choice, that's a stress. You've got into the college of your choice, but the campus interviews do not go well, that's a stress. The campus interviews go well, you've got a job, but you don't get promotion, that's a stress. You get promotion, but your colleagues are not cooperative, that can be a stress. If you're heterosexual and not married, that's a stress. If you're married and you don't have children, that's a stress. If you have a child and a second one is on the way, that's a stress. You have a child with a disability, that's a stress. So how does a campus as a community, how does the scientist community really create an ecology by which you do not wait for stresses to impinge on your life, but you create a culture of conversations within the student community and the teaching community, that when you're faced with a challenge, you immediately know ways in which you can deal with the challenges that face you. What this means, therefore, is if you look at a student community and a student, what are the contexts where mental health issues are likely to play out in the student's life? Is it to do with academics, scholastic acquisition, related issues such as the relationship with a supportive mentor as opposed to a mentor with whom there is a tense relationship? Is it an experiment having gone wrong? Is it about your work being claimed by someone else? Is it about success, recruitment, um, your patent being taken away? And so there's that whole spectrum. Then there are events that occur in your life, particularly events that are traumatic or stressful. These could be loss experiences, grief experiences, experiences of abuse, experiences which center around gender and sexuality. And therefore, what about the predicament of a student in the community that you so ably assist? A student who, let's say, uh, comes from a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or a transgendered or a queer identity. And what narratives does this individual have to traverse in a system or an ecology that is essentially patriarchal, heterosexist, and homophobic in its construction? What if the student is outed or comes out and is not accepted? So this is another area of, and then of course there is relationship tensions both from your family of origin and some of the young adult relationships and the frustrations that you get into, and the fear of discovery, either because you feel that a recourse that you've taken will be disapproved or is forbidden, or the fact that your experiments with, let's say, substances, perhaps alcohol, perhaps nicotine, perhaps weed, and the danger of being found out, of being castigated, and how do you respond to these kind of issues? So this is a context that I wanted to present to you as an idea that the relationship of preceptors, of facilitators, of adults, of parents, of teachers with their proteges, their mentees, their students, the youth that you work with, is often not based on a culture of conversations. It is based on a culture of instruction, expectation, and obedience. And this is usually problematic because when they are in a situation which is challenging or in a predicament, they are not able to, and they hide their situation and their mental state quite well till water rises above the bridge. In the words sung in the mellifluous voice of Jagjit Singh when he says, "Tum itna jo muskura rahe ho, kya gham hai jisko chupa rahe ho?" What is the pain that you hide beneath the exterior smile that you have on your face. तुम इतना जो मुस्कुरा रहे हो, क्या गम है जिसको छुपा रहे हो. Let's dive in deeper, friends. Let's dive in deeper. In mental health, in psychology, we often refer to something known as phenomenology. And if you look at the phenomenology of suicide, the spectrum of suicidality, whether it is academic stress, whether it's failure, relationship tensions, struggles with sexuality and gender, um, loss and grief experiences, trauma experiences that drive you to the precipice of problematic decision making. There is a difference between a person who says, I am in a difficult situation, मैं एक कठिन परिस्थिति में हूं, as opposed to a person who says that my difficult situation is becoming unbearable. मेरी कठिन परिस्थिति असहनीय है. सहिष्णुलिक ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. I do not wish to live. मैं जीना नहीं चाहता. ಬದುಕಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಆಸೆ ಇಲ್ಲ ನನಗೆ. I wish to die. मैं मरना चाहता हूं. I wish to kill myself. They are not the same. I am in a difficult situation. My difficult situation is intolerable. I do not wish to live. I wish to die. I wish to kill myself. They are not the same. And in terms of intervention, it is very critical in the relationship either of a client and a counselor or of a mentee and a mentor that you catch the life narrative of that individual in terms of where he or she is positioned so that you don't prevent the narrative from proceeding to the next level of processing. This can only occur if there is a relationship based on openness, on trust, on disclosure, and of mutual respect, so that people have the comfort and a courage that comes from both comfort and confidence, that this can be shared, without my predicament being belittled or trivialized. So this is a very critical framework to keep in mind in terms of suicidality and the phenomenology that I speak of. So adverse childhood experiences and how a human being has a sense of personal worth or value and what that has to do then with the approach that you take to life challenges and decisions. The stage in thinking processes in relation to a difficult situation, to recognize levels of severity, and the importance of creating an ecology, a space within institutions, universities, college campuses, within the academic fraternity, where there is an open and transparent exchange, not just of information, but also of feelings. That because the truth is, if you look at why there is so much of emphasis, in fact, it would interest you to know that UGC has recently set up a committee, and I am a member of that committee, in consonance with the National Education Policy of 2020, where they have insisted on provision in campuses of counseling systems for emotional and adjustment problems. They also spoke about motivated, energized, and capable faculty to essentially create socio-emotional and academic support and counseling and mentoring. So, as faculty, your expertise is not just in teaching inorganic chemistry or aeronautical engineering, but also what mentoring means. And the question that arises is, what is the current status of these services as far as states of distress and despondency and depression are concerned? This really brings me to the whole issue of value. And I quote Dr. Anand Prakash, psychologist in Delhi, who's also a member of this UGC committee. And what Dr. Anand Prakash said is that a student needs to be valued not just as a cognitive laborer. A student needs to be valued not just as a cognitive laborer, but as an emotional, a cultural, a social, and a psychological entity. And therefore, if there are existing structures within college campuses where you institutionalize health and well-being with a dedicated center and professionally trained people, where other than these professionals, the teachers are themselves trained, and you recognize college programs where the focus is not just on academic excellence and future career, but on emotional and mental health issues. And you create quality wellness programs and support systems with some minimum standards. And for each, all of you present here, all 50 of you, if you were to do an audit in the departments that you work in, um, or the divisions that you work in, the campuses that you work in, if you do a mental health audit, UGC, for example, there are 1,000 universities and almost 46,000 colleges. Are they networked with departments of psychology? Are they networked with centers of excellence in mental health or tertiary teaching hospitals or with district mental health programs? Does the National Council of Technical Education recognize the importance of activities, processes, and practices where mental health is concerned? Can we, to quote Paulo Freire, when he writes in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, can we conscientize campuses? Can we make campuses more humane so that experiences of exclusion, experiences of being devalued, experiences of frustration, experiences of failure have systems and spaces and relationships where you have the comfort to share. So if you look at what is it about suicide, would it be right to say that all people who attempt suicide are mentally ill? Not necessarily true. Uh, do mental illnesses like depression, depression of bipolar origin, even which are called the severe mental illnesses, that are they linked with suicidality? Yes, they are. Do they constitute the entire context and platform for suicidality? No. In fact, many people who attempt suicide may not have a diagnosable mental illness. Then what is the critical context around which this behavior is located? And here is my thesis, which I'd like to share with you uh, as some closing thoughts. Many people who work to look at the relationship between challenging situations, stress, trauma, failure, frustration, relationship issues, struggles with identity, struggles with gender, struggles with sexuality, and then that on the one hand there is depression, and on the other hand there is suicidality. So this whole range and gamut of contexts And in a scientist community, in a student community, what is most critical to recognize and acknowledge is that context matters. To understand the context of that individual student. What is that individual student dealing with? Has come from some remote hamlet in Bihar and has suddenly come to Bangalore to a campus which is very different and has struggles of cultural adaptation, experiences exclusion. Now, there is a pecking order, my friends, that uh, a gay man from an upper middle class family in an urban campus can more or less blend and navigate his way. A lesbian student from a small town in Kerala, from a middle class family, in the same college campus will have a completely different struggle and narrative. And these gender differences and social and cultural differences are very important to understand if we have to conscientize a campus and look at each individual's struggles and their personal stories. So there's this whole gamut of contexts: trauma, loss, failure, relationship breakdown, misunderstanding with families, substance use, struggles with gender, struggles with sexuality, failure experiences, thesis not going well, uh, job interviews not going well, the department is not supportive, the guide is very strict, the guide is not understanding cultural adaptations, and there is depression and there is suicidality. The relationship between depression and suicidality is actually structured by a phenomena called hopelessness. And hopelessness has two components: my problem cannot be solved, and there is no one to help me. And this is what Parmesh referred to when he spoke about cognitive behavior therapy and when he spoke about dialectic behavior therapy, where you look at these kind of belief systems or cognitions, if you were, and through a process of dialogue which is called Socratic, and respectful, attentive conversation, no instruction, no advice, no sermonizing, but through listening to a person's narratives and giving alternative ideas of alternative ways to look at the situation to actually shift the person from a space of hopelessness to a space of other ways in which I can resolve my predicament or other ways that I can come out of my problem. That this is for that group of people who do not have severe mental illness. That severe mental illness and the red flags there is a different cup of tea. And if someone has already made an attempt and then comes into contact with you, that person is at 100 times more risk than someone who's in a situation of predicament but has not made an attempt yet. So the crucial issue here is conflict resolution and life skills, where suicidality is projected as perhaps a legitimate or a practiced method of conflict resolution. We are in a problem that because there is no other way in which that. And this is where in college campuses we should not wait for conflicts to take place. We should not wait for, even when there is no stress, there is no episode that happened of a student who hung himself or herself in the hostel room. Uh, of course, when such an incident occurs, that also is an opportunity to create a dialogue rather than respond with discomfort and silence and guilt and consternation, confusion, perhaps even anger. And these are standard responses. Remember again what Dr. Kalyan Sundaram says. What happens to the family and the others who are left behind? And what is their response? And these are the responses: consternation and confusion. Why did he do it? I had no indication, never said anything. Anger, look what he's done. And, couldn't she have spoken to me? Or guilt that, I wish I had recognized, I wish I had done more. Some hints were given, I didn't. So there's a whole range of So even a campus cannot respond with silence or consternation or guilt or anger when an event occurs. That is your opportunity to actually gather and embrace the entire community in an ongoing dialogue where you recognize the grief, the collective grief that all of us feel. And this is particularly important because sharing is one of the most critical issues to resolve the kind of trauma that we speak about. And it's in this context, friends, that and particularly because we are in the situation of the pandemic, that I would really like to share with you something which is so evocative and so moving that um, and this has to do with death. It has to do with sharing, maybe not necessarily with suicide, but it certainly has to do with death and sharing. And this is a blog, friends, by a Delhi-based journalist called Mohammad Asim. Asim जनाब, मैं बहुत शुक्रगुजार हूँ आपका इस बेहतरीन. I quote: "If pain is personal and individual, which is so often the case, it can drag us down a solitary hole. But when it becomes shared and collective, pain can lift us out, extracting us from solitude into the company of those who are suffering as well. For days, I nursed my pain deep within me, being the elder son who had to look after ill parents mourning the loss of their loved son-in-law to COVID. I didn't have the time and space to process my emotions. I had to be strong for my sister and her two teen children who had lost their partner and father in the cruelest fashion. I couldn't cry in front of them, could I? I vented one day in a Facebook post. I had to recount each and every horrid detail that I and my sister went through to clear the burden in my heart. That post was me crying out loud. Writing, as they say, is cathartic. Then came a deluge of calls, messages from friends, people I knew, and from total strangers. Thousands poured their hearts out. They showed support. They shared my pain. I got some of the most poignant and emotional messages from people I had lost touch with and hadn't spoken to for years. Many shared their own experiences. I felt their pain. We became one. Our timelines and inboxes are a tide of grief and suffering. Who would have thought that condolences, RIP, broken heart emojis would become the top prompts on our phone keypads? Everyone is overwhelmed. We ought to share it, tell others about ours, and listen to theirs. No one will emerge unscathed from this pandemic, or indeed, friends, from adverse childhood experiences, student stresses, campus dynamics, which are everlasting epidemics. My heart cries for kids orphaned in a sudden brutal stroke. A dear friend who is part of a counseling collective was asked to talk to a 5-year-old who lost both his parents to COVID, loss experience. The child tells her that everyone around is mourning and hasn't had time to talk to him. But I have lost my parents, no? Just 5. What can anyone tell that boy to make him feel better? I cry with a professor friend whose husband is battling for his life in the ICU. She couldn't properly mourn a friend she had just lost. I have to stay strong for my son and my husband, she says. I let her cry. What do you tell a single mother who loses her son just 17 to COVID? Will any words ever bring closure for her? On a video call arranged by a good doctor, a young kid sings, तेरा मुझसे है पहले का नाता कोई. To his mother, breathing her last. Final goodbyes, no matter how painful, are very important. Can you ever listen to that song again without shedding a tear? मेरा तुझसे तो पहले का नाता कोई. A 19-year-old nephew who recently recovered from COVID goes to donate plasma in the middle of the night to a total stranger after an appeal on a social media platform. His mother is scared about him going to the hospital in the middle of the night, but she allows him. She stays awake, praying till he returns. They feel good about helping someone in need. He gets to know the next day that the person didn't make it. He grieves for a stranger. Friends, pain binds us all. This bond is the only system that is working today. Every sob, every cry, every scream, every share, every blank stare, every helping hand, every fading heartbeat is a monument of our shared grief. We will carry it and mourn it for the rest of our lives. Mohammed Asim, Delhi based journalist. My point being that the mitigation of depression, distress, despondency, and the exit from suicidality is firmly embedded in sharing and in creating a compassionate, empathic community where you conscientize the campus in a manner that you understand the dynamics which of why an individual in his or her life story and the reality of her narrative is struggling for value and for identity because you have an idealized self, your sense of what is ideal, what I wish to achieve, what I want to become. And wherever there is an obstacle, a bottleneck, an invalidation, a trivialization, a belittling, an exclusion, it eats away with the notion of the affirmed self and then pushes you to that level of hopelessness where you then begin to question the value of life, particularly the value of your own life. So, how do you restore that value? And the restoration of that value occurs by sharing of pain, by validation, and by providing a scaffolding of support which says, ki, you know, at least uh, Aditya Kaushik respected me. Anusuya Gondopadhyay মানে খুব ভালো আমার কথাটা শুনলাম. Dr. C.P. Ravikumar, how much of time he gave me. Uh, as opposed to saying, listen, I'm a little busy now. Can you come at some other point of time? That I went with trouble, and I was just brushed off. That so how do you train and tune yourself to be receptive to the kind of messages that the student community is actually giving you? That and what are the red flags for more severe mental health, kind of problems that, and how are you, alert to the messages that are coming that someone hasn't come to classes for a week, someone hasn't stepped out of the room, there's obvious loss of weight, breaking down very easily. These are all red flags that. So between recognizing red flags, having settled predetermined networks where you can refer people with whom you have collaboration and liaison, to setting up college programs where you don't wait for an incident to occur, but you create platforms and systems of absolution and platforms and systems of discourse and conversation on emotional issues. I go back to what Anand Prakash said. A student needs to be valued not as a cognitive laborer, but as an emotional, cultural, social, and psychological entity. And do our campuses really, and if a campus did this, I assure you that the incidence not just of suicide, but of despondency, distress, and depression will come down. So this is the kind of framework that I wanted to share with you. I am also taking the liberty, friends, to put on chat the links of a repository of materials of the community work that we do. Many of them, if in the resources, have our life skills and our gender sexuality manual, because a lot of depression and suicidality occur in the context of relationships and of struggles with gender and sexuality and substance use. And these are simple methods that you can use in your individual conversations with the students who report directly to you, your PhD candidates, your MPhil candidates, your master's students. Uh, it also has our YouTube link where we have more than 100 programs which I put this out because all this is free access public domain. As Dr. Kalyan Sundaram knows, we do not believe in copyright. We believe in copy left. And therefore, these are intended to be used in college campuses. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Pass it to your family, friends, and your networks so that the message of youth well-being and student well-being pervades into the fabric of the education system in keeping with what the vision of NEP 2020 is. So this is the framework that I wanted to present to you, and I'm happy to spend the last half an hour of the program that we have at hand for Dr. Kalyan Sundaram and I to jointly curate and respond to issues that you put on chat. Thank you very much for the privilege of this platform and for your attention, and for all 50 of you who've taken time off from what I'm sure are your busy academic and research schedules to be on this session. I'm very privileged and honored. Thank you.
Uh, what can I say? Thank you, Shekhar. It can be everything I want to say. Shekhar has taken you through a journey of facts, figures, and as is his wont, wrung your emotions dry, made you touch to your inner core, made you feel at every fiber that you have to understand what is it like to be in the space of suicidal issues, suicidal thoughts, of people who have left you behind. And you start wondering, is it something that I have seen, I've heard? Is it something that I could have done something about? Is it something that I should have done something about? Is it something as a collective group of intelligent people, erudite scholars, are we doing something about the set of people whom Shekhar very aptly described as the student community, who are actually the future of this country? How is that academic pressures, peer pressures seem to get at us? How are the same students who pass out go into a work culture which only makes it worse for you? Take an example of an IT industry. 16 hours a day, is it tenable? You work for not India, you work for US at one time, you work for Middle East, you work for Singapore, you work for Australia, and the same set of people who go abroad, what is called an on-site, they work 5 days a week, wind up at 5 p.m., weekends are holidays. How is that we have these two kinds of systems and expect these people not to be under stress? And we know stress causes inflammation in the brain. It impacts what we call HPA axis. There is enough evidence to show suicidality and brain changes in chemistry go hand in hand these days. A lot of research is being done. There is plenty for us to ponder about, and there is some for me to wind up. But now this is the time for interaction. This is the time for the audience to come out and talk about what is it that they feel about it. Is there something that seems to touch them? There's something they need to clarify. There's something they want to talk about, or maybe even something they want to challenge the notion which Dr. Shekhar Seshadri has thrown at the ring. Ask him. I agree. Ask him. I do not agree with the concept of what you have said. He's the kind of a person who will come back calmly, assuredly, and tell you why we say what we are saying. I ask professionals, we don't claim to know everything that we see. But with our experience, we know we have seen them, we have worked with them, we have been challenged. There are occasions Shekhar would agree that we've seen a patient last week and the patient seems to be doing well, only to hear when the person has not turned up for an appointment, to find from the relative or a friend, he hung himself last week. We don't understand that. So when something happens, we ask ourselves, what did go wrong? Did we miss something? In fact, Shekhar would have heard this term, which my teacher, my first teacher in psychiatry, the late Dr. Venkobarov, used to talk about in the 60s and early 70s as psychological autopsy. When some event of this nature happens, there is something called a psychological autopsy that happens with the team that is looking after, which includes the family members and friends, to gather knowledge and information and understand, so that this knowledge that we have gathered is helpful for the next set of people that we come across. I think I'm giving this platform for the rest of the people who have gathered here to ask questions, so that Dr. Shekhar and I will try and answer to the best of our experience and ability. So the platform is open for anyone to start clarifications and questions. So I don't see any questions coming up in the chat. I'm sure the way Paramesh is a very inquisitive, very sharp brain sitting there, he has noted something. I think he's going to be the one who will ask some questions. Paramesh, I leave you to start, and then maybe you will stimulate your colleague sitting there to ask us more questions. Paramesh.
Thank you, Kalyan Sundara. It's a wonderful talk by Seshadri. I think I had about 5-6 cases in Lakeside. These are all adolescents. After the examination, like you pointed out, they came in because parents talked ill of that. They wanted to commit suicide, taken some medication here and there. Now the rule is there. Any suspected suicidal tendency, it is a police case. We have to inform the police. Here is the situation for me. I have to save this boy, has his future, and putting the parents, everything in difficult situation. And me, not to dealing that is also legally I am wrong. It was a difficult situation for a doctor at that situation. But I took decision not to make a police case. And I talked to the individual of this boy, look, if I give the case, the police come there, you have to go to the police station, your parent, they harass, whole lot of things will be there. And is a black spot in your life lifelong. This is something has come in a difficult situation. You have to learn the art, how to cope up with this situation. Talk to the friends, talk to anybody who knows about it, how to overcome. That's about 5 cases I didn't make it. Well, I lied to the Department of Police, but I saved the life. They are still thankful, as a matter of fact. This boy is still there in the UK, and his children and all the things, he still enjoys that. He was a suicidal case, severe asthmatic. His father is a veterinary, he died. Mother is alone. He wanted to commit suicide for something happened in the family. So these are all the things. Sometimes it's very difficult. Can we make the legal issues to be removed in this context? But psychiatry department, it can able to help that. I don't want to make.
I think Shekhar, Paramesh is a very critical question, and Shekhar has loads of experience working with children and adolescents. I'm sure they deal with this kind of situation, to be or not to be. Which side do we move on? Is it legally tenable to be a suicidal attempt? Is it a criminal law now? I think things have changed. Shekhar, I'm sure you'd like to respond to this.
I have a couple of very quick responses. It would amuse all of you to know, since our legal systems come heavily from the British system and changes are taking place, it would amuse you to know what the punishment for attempted suicide was about 100 years ago. It was death by hanging.
Oh my God.
So, and there was the first such case where it concerned a policeman called Maruti Shanbal, and the case went to Supreme Court, where the argument was that um, prosecuting me for attempting is actually ultra virus of my fundamental right. And Justice Sachar's court had actually upheld that. Then it was overturned. At that time, from some agencies, we had filed an affidavit in the Supreme Court to say that attempted suicide is not a legal problem, it's a human problem. And after many iterations, even the Indian Psychiatric Society, which has a specialty branch, has made a representation, Dr. Parmesh,
Yeah.
and there is a change in the law now. Uh, we must also understand, Dr. Parmesh, that there are political reasons why the law was there. This is actually people who go on hunger strike for political reasons are actually prosecuted under this law, so that so there is a whole political background to why they wanted to retain attempted suicide as a punishable offense, that and an abetment to suicide also as a punishable offense. That but because of persistent efforts on part of the mental health fraternity, this law has kind of changed. That the other issue that I wanted to bring to the notice of this august audience um, is precisely what you said, that sometimes you're in a situation where you have to deal with the acute crisis at hand, and some of the legal issues cannot be the primary issue, in terms of your priority of dispositions or actions. To put it very simply, when a man is drowning, that's not the time to teach him how to swim. You have to save him first. You can teach him swimming later. And this is exactly what crisis intervention as a specialty means in the counseling and therapy sector. And if you look at some of the fine agencies that do this, and I would draw your attention particularly to the very fine work of a lady who Dr. Kalyan Sundaram and I know very well, called Dr. Lakshmi Vijay Kumar, who runs a center which is nationally renowned and internationally known, called Sneha in Chennai. These are people who volunteer. They are bankers, they are teachers, and they volunteer to do time. And these are helplines. They're telephone helplines, but they also do face-to-face. And there are many agencies like this across India. And, collectively, some of them are networked as part of the Samaritans network. So that's another thing you need to keep in mind. The third thing, since you spoke about young people, Dr. Parmesh, I want to bring to your notice is that recently, in the last several years, there is this phenomena which is known as non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI. These are kids who come with a lot of the cutting behaviors. They are not oriented towards death or dying or suicide. It is for tension relief or anger. And it is almost like a contagion. And if you look at childcare institutions, particularly, you'll find that invariably 50, 60, 70% of them will have multiple cuts on their, and this is a kind of a contagion, and the whole self-harm contagion hypothesis there. So if you look at the repository on the website that I put, nimhanschildprotect.in, and you go to resources, we have a manual on non-suicidal self-injury in older children and adolescents, and how you deal with it using some simple principles of dialectic behavior therapy. But really, just it's a very similar principle to the term that Dr. Kalyan Sundaram used in where completed suicide and you do a psychological autopsy. What you do here is, even if there is an acute event of a single cut or multiple cuts, that you do a debriefing. You don't castigate. You don't say, why did you do this? Or why have you done this? Or, this is not the way to, but you say, I know that you've been upset about something. Let's speak about it, So let's start with when did the distress start? When did the tension start? What was its context? What did you think? I'm available for you in case you have situations of challenge, predicament, or tension going ahead. I'm happy to assist you. And look at the whole problem-solving technique, Dr. Parmesh, that you referred to in your introductory remarks. So these are some trends that we need to keep in mind. The whole helpline construct, crisis intervention, non-suicidal self-injury, and our approaches to that.
Thank you, Shekhar. Are there any other questions from the floor? Anybody would like to, if you have not written anything in the chat, if anyone wishes to raise hand. Yes, sir, please go ahead.
Dr. Sheshari, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk. I think we're all in a bit of race. This emotional relationship, what we would have in our childhood days, where we would all sit as a family, whether it is for dinner or post-dinner, I think this is being lost for generations now. Instead, we are saying about counseling, which our elders would easily do it without the terminology of counseling or a professional label to it. So where do you think we are heading, the next generation? We all have got ourselves into some kind of a rat race. We are just running, working.
Someone actually said, Dr. Ravi Kumar, that if you win the rat race, you'll still be a rat.
Yeah, that's true.
So, in fact, I had done a workshop production of Dance Theatre 1. The theme of that play was the realities and results of being a rat. And looking at different forms of but to come back to the significance of the point that you're making, the whole blended communities, blended societies that we live in, and particularly with this whole notion of migration. And it would interest you to know, Dr. Ravi Kumar, that the theme of the World Federation of Mental Health, World Mental Health Day on October 10th this year, is on inequality. And if you look at the whole equity paradigm, particularly from a family and a student perspective, and if you look at the whole Kota, Rajasthan IIT preparation, and the kind of distress, tension, and the suicides there of people who leave their homes and are in alien circumstances, in alien environment, with this entire pressure of heavy investments being made, that the pressure, therefore, to live up to that investment that has been made, and the guilt of failure is often intolerable. And this is, I think, it's an unfair burden to place on an 18-year-old, for an 18-year-old to. So I think this is the reason why we are now getting into, we are really moving in. So there are immediate, intermediate, and distal preventive approaches to, which is why you remember I said preventing approaches, suicidal tendencies, and the whole the approach that we have. If you look at a distal approach, we come back to the whole notion of parenting. And what we are doing now is in the network that we have, particularly through Samvad, where, because we are operating in 29 states right now, and we are taking a completely public child and youth mental health approach. And now getting into the panchayat system to really conscientize the panchayat, and we are starting with 112 aspirational districts from the 700 odd districts to really take well-being as a national agenda. That, and in fact, in the whole reconstructed national health mission, to look at these well-being centers. What this means, Dr. Ravi Kumar and other friends who are gathered here, is a basic question we are having is, if you're heterosexual, why do you marry? What is your motivation in getting married? What is your motivation in having children? Are children business investments so that you invest in them, and when you are old and retired and infirm, that they will look after you? Is it a business investment, or is it just the joy of seeing the growth of an independent identity with an independent agency. It is not that you have expectations that. So the moment there is the guilt of investment and the guilt of expectation on this 18-year-old and the disappointment that you have set for yourself and the fact that you'll disappoint someone else, it's a double whammy for someone who then doesn't make it that. So I think that a re-examination and one must question this paradigm, and one must question the paradigm, therefore, of where education has gone. You know, this whole competition paradigm, but not compassion. That, and I think if you look at NEP 2020, it's a very complex document, but I think there are ideological shifts that have occurred in NEP 2020 which will pervade into the fabric of universities over a period of time. It's a change that's not going to happen overnight. But what has happened is that education has been usurped by the corporate world. Let me be very frank on this. Education has been subverted and usurped by the corporate world to suit its profit-making market agenda. It is now not about an individual's well-being and so, which is why NEP 2020 is talking not about career, it is talking about life skills and livelihood from a different perspective. Take a gap year, you know, travel, do other stuff, and your credits will carry that. So they are taking that paradigm to keep. So I know I'm giving a very ecological and a very distal answer, Ravi, to the question that you raised, but I think we really need to re-examine the notion of the family and the notion of parenting, and that it should shift from a culture of expectations, instruction, and obedience to a culture of conversations and to a culture of celebration of the identity of. In simple terms, a child is not equal to a student, because then good student is equal to good child and a bad student is equal to bad child. Whereas a child is equal to son, daughter, grandson, grandchild, niece, nephew, brother, sibling, sister, Kannadiga, Bangalorean, vegetarian, music lover, nature lover, and student. So studenthood is one part of your identity. It cannot define your entire identity. So this definition of identity goes a long way in then determining well-being. And therefore, when push comes to shove, you don't respond with the kind of cognitive distortions that may other occur, because you have limited your way of how you अपने आप अपने व्यक्तित्व को अब जिस तरह से परिभाषित करते हैं, व्यक्तित्व की परिभाषा जो है वो छात्रित्व होने के नाते अगर परिभाषित हो तो हमारा अस्तित्व बड़ा सीमित हो जाता है. Our existence becomes very limited and constricted, and then you struggle. So either you lash out in anger, or you constrict yourself. So,
suddenly, sorry, I seem to have suddenly lost and I am back again. Can you hear me?
Oh, very clearly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Shekhar. Just before we wind up, one point I think which is of paramount importance in today's world. What do you think about the social media and its contextual issues related to especially health issues, mental health issues, and unfortunately, suicidal attempts and finality in that issue? I think it's a relevant issue which every one of us are facing.
Absolutely.
Which is in the context of what Dr. Ravi Kumar also mentioned about people are not sitting and eating together. If they are sitting and eating, they are looking at the mobiles and other platforms, and the food seems to be moving in or not at all, but they're all sitting in a kind of a pantomime kind of a situation. Shekhar, maybe I want you to say a few words about it because it's extremely contextual. Every single person who's sitting and listening has had some adverse experience about it, for sure.
There are two aspects to this where social media is concerned. If you look at the World Health Organization and the International Association of Suicide Prevention and what they have said about how media reporting of suicide is actually done, and and this is known as the Werther effect, WERTHER. It functions as almost as information from as available information that people take this as a viable option in the face of a predicament. So there are media guidelines of how events of this nature should be reported. There can be more compassionate and more empowering ways of reporting it, and there are ways. So this is one aspect of social media guidelines on reporting. The other aspect that Dr. Kalyansundram refers to is the way that of the digital world, and let's look at this in perspective. People perhaps like Sundar, Parmesh, Ravi, we are perhaps digital immigrants. The children of today are digital natives. They are born in a digital world. We were children at a time where there was no mobile phone. If dad went to Delhi from Jharkhand, Bihar, where I grew up, or he went to United States, there was something known as a trunk call, which also was not reliable. But till he came back a month later, there was no means of knowing. Now, at the click of a phone, you can call Iceland, Greenland, anytime you want. You can do FaceTime, WhatsApp videos, Skype, and all kinds of stuff that. So also what the pandemic has done, and let's look at this in perspective. If you look at the digital world, online education and so on, online education had come to stay even before the pandemic. I will not name organizations. One of them is so well known that they are even funding the Indian cricket team and BCCI. The point is to come back to the issue that Ravi and Sundar had raised, that it's very important to have a family plan. The idea is not to say no video, no screen time, no mobile phones, but how do you so it's about time management and it's about a family plan. It's also about consistency. A father and a mother who are techies cannot be on their laptops and their screen and then telling their children, don't look at your screens. And you have to set time aside where you yourself put it aside to say, this is our time together to share and talk without the. Or if you have to use the mobile itself, it's about maintaining contact with the extended family of online education. But a day has to be divided into pursuing your hobbies, about home chores and your home responsibilities. Some for online education, and some maybe just chat with your buddies or whether you're surfing the net or you're gaming or whatever that. And so there is something known as internet gaming addiction, or what is called as behavioral addiction. These days, it's become an entity which has found its way into the classificatory systems as well. So there are those group of people who would be severely addicted. So if a kid is like gaming for 14 hours a day, and we make this family plan, a parent may come back to you saying, but doctor, he's still gaming for 6 hours. But the fact that it's come down from 14 hours to 6 hours is also substantive improvement.
Yeah.
So there are two aspects to the whole social media and the media issue. One is media reporting on suicidality. The other is the digital world that we live in, accentuated by the pandemic, and how time management and a family plan and supervised, an agreement on supervised screen time as opposed to unsupervised, processed screen time versus unprocessed screen time makes a lot of difference, particularly with young children. I'll tell you one thing that I'm really concerned about, and this will resonate with Parmesh, that see, if you look at 2-month-old babies, 6-month-old babies, in any case, they were not going out, they were pretty much at home. The 14, 15, 16-year-olds have their own way of navigating. I'm deeply concerned about the 3, 4, 5, 6 years old in terms of child development, because 1.5 years into the pandemic, they have lost access to social spaces. Loss of social spaces, loss of structure, loss of routine, loss of predictability, loss of educational opportunities, loss of peer interaction, loss of play. What is going to happen to child development of these 4, 5, 6-year-olds 5 years from now, 7 years from now? Has any person in child development, a child developmental psychologist, a developmental pediatrician, looked at the critical aspect of the preschoolers and what's going to happen to them in terms of their psyche? The point that Sundar made about how certain experiences are tagged not just as memories, but they also have neurochemical and neurotransmitter impacted. So there are so the pandemic has very many critical issues to look at. And one last comment I have to make. This is, and I'm not saying this from the context of a voice of doom, but please do note that on 23rd of September 2021, this was said on a program organized here. Mental health is a ticking time bomb. It's a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode. And unless we take collective action to conscientize our campuses and to look at the kind of community approach that I have started, we're going to be in a very difficult situation. Over to you,
Thank you,
Sumit.
Shekhar. I think we're almost at the end. 2 more minutes. Just want to flag a couple of things. Surrounding the suicide of any event, there's a whole amount of grief that is being experienced. Grieving family members, grieving friends. And sometimes in the context of an individual who has completed suicide, we may have not paid sufficient attention to the grieving people who have been left behind, who themselves are battling for answers which they do not have. In this context, I would like to refer you to an excellent book written by a doctor in Chennai called Left Behind. Make a note of this. Left Behind. Written by a doctor, Nandini Murali. She lost her husband for suicide, who himself was a doctor. Excellent book. Some of you may have read it, but there are questions and we do not have answers. Second thing, I want to make a point about several things which Shekhar mentioned, but one particular thing. How do we look at the report card of our children? He alluded to the report card of a marks card that is coming. I think he said something deeper in my context, which I see it. The report card of our growing up. Marks card is only an event. Report card of several exposures the children have, several experiences they have. They come and talk to their parents, or the parents discover about such events. And when an interaction happens, how do we as parents or grandparents interact in such a situation? Why is it important? Shekhar did mention about the impact it has on a child's growing brain. These impacts are well embedded as emotional experiences. Such emotional experiences, when they are rekindled as an adult, that you have not done your project well, your thesis is not up to the mark, and your PhD, I'm sorry, it's not going to be accepted. The child who has had that embedded experience, this adult is reliving that experience. When you relive that experience, given the circumstances around you, you may have mental health issues which may reach a very gravitational proportions with terrible consequences. Last point. I'm very fond of saying this. We see several multi-speciality hospitals coming from the context of a doctor. Whenever you see a multi-speciality hospital that is being advertised, both digitally and in huge pamphlets and huge boards that are brought in front of the hospital, they talk about several specialties that you can wander into and gain access and get help. Do you see anywhere it is mentioned about mental health specialists being available in that building? Zilch. Not there at all. Why? 30% of the people who approach any hospital have primary mental health issues. Another 30% have secondary add-on mental health issues. Why is that not important? Last point. We all have annual health checkup for students who enter the campus, faculty who enter the campus, annual health checkup for everything below the neck, every part of your body. Is there any health checkup that includes mental health checkup? Why is that not important?
Good point.
We are paying a price for not paying attention to these issues. It's not only academic campuses. Campuses where you take a job, health checkup, go to this corporate hospital, go to that corporate hospital, get these tests done, all of it. And at the age of 20, 25, most of them are going to be normal. Everybody is declared healthy until proved otherwise. Why not mental health checkup? Difficult? Not possible? Or do we not want to address it because we will not know what to do with it?
Correct.
I'm leaving this question unanswered. I can answer these questions, but I leave it for you to ponder. Given the interest both Shekhar and Parmesh have children and adolescents, I'm sure the Divecha Center sometime in the future will devote a day of discussion on child health and mental health issues. With that, I would like to thank the organizers, the Divecha Center, Dr. Paramesh, and all of you there on behalf of my dear friend and colleague from the two Seshadris, saying, thank you for giving this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think
Okay. Now I request Dr. Ravi Kumar to give the vote of thanks. The wonderful discussion what we had.
thank you, Dr. Parmesh.
Yeah.
I think you both must have heard about the two Ronnies from the UK. I don't know if you have watched their movies or comedies. One of the best comedians. I think we can say the two Sheshadris. I think it was an excellent session. Both the speaker and the moderator, I think we had learnt a lot, and it's been absolute pleasure. And unfortunately, I think due to time restraints, we have to stop it today. But hopefully next year, in the next academic part, we will look into the points which Dr. Kalyanasundram has raised. Probably we should start from there. How do we include mental health as part of the health checkup? I think the answer everybody knows, Dr. Kalyanasundram, what you said. We all know the answer. We don't want to answer. That's it. Thank you very much, Dr. Seshadri. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Kalyanasundram. And also thank you to Dr. Paramesh, Dr. Jayojirao, and all the participants who are there towards the end of the session. And thank you, Indian Institute of Science and Divecha Center. Thank you. We bring